Hello, everybody. We're picking up where we left off in Unit 4, and we had made it a good portion of the way through Chapter 6 last week. And the one thing I want to begin with this week, which I haven't really been stressing a lot this semester, but yet is really pretty critical before we begin to do any work in this class. What I want you guys to do is version your work. And normally, when I've taught this class in the past, I make a real point of it every week and I demonstrate it. And the reason I haven't been talking about it or demonstrating it is frankly because I've been forgetting to do it myself. I've been flying kind of by the seat of my pants, hoping that, basically I know enough here not to screw things up. But I'm going to tell you what, even if you know enough and you got, great skills doing this, there's always that possibility that something's going to go wrong either with your equipment or some line of code you typed in or, God knows what, and you lose all the work you've done so far. And because of the nature of the work we're doing, where we're building upon what we've done each previous week, it becomes more and more critical as we proceed to make those versions and backups as we go so that you can always revert to your last saved version in case of something bad happening. So why don't we go ahead and do that process first. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to uh, drop down to my file system. I'm going to do this through the Windows File Manager. It's just the easiest way to do it. So I'm going to go into my projects folder, which is at the root of my C drive. So far, and this is actually pretty disappointing because I haven't versioned my work at all once the whole time that we've been in the semester. And we are going now on week 8 in the course. So we're more than halfway through. And for me, that's a concern. And, if this was a real world project that I was working on, I would probably shame myself for not having created versions so far. So to version your work, it's actually a pretty simple process. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first figure out how far we got last time in the book. And I know that I recorded it into the video, but perhaps you guys can help me with how far I got. Now, I think, if I remember correctly, we probably got about this far. Remember, we typed the reload command. Remember that? Or was that another reload command? Nope, we did this. We did the migration. We typed the reload. Does that all seem familiar? Yes? And then I picked a logical spot to stop. Now, what I'm going to do just to make sure of my exact position is I'm going to pause this recording for a moment and check my previous video. So thank goodness for recordings, and you can see this is exactly where we stopped at the bottom of page 89, and I was encouraging you in the previous video to go ahead and read this next little section here. So I know exactly where that is in the book. In fact, I'm just about right on top of it. So we're going to pick up right in this spot. All right. So that's an important thing. The reason I'm concerned about the page number, frankly, is because I'm actually going to put that into the file name of the version of the work that I'm saving so that I know exactly where I left off in my work. So I'm going to drop over to the file system now, and I'm just very simply, this is the most rudimentary of ways to create versions of your work, but you know what? It's highly effective as well. I'm just going to right click and copy, and then I'm going to right click and paste. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. That is not, did you see what I just did? I'm opening this up in Visual Studio, not what I wanted to do. All right, but this is amusing for YouTube, anybody that's watching on YouTube, to watch a Ruby project opened up inside of Visual Studio. And guess what, folks? You can actually do it. I don't know if it'll recognize the language that well, but all right, I'm going to go ahead and close that. So I apologize, and I'm going to delete the little Visual Studio artifact there. So once again, right-click, copy, right-click, paste, and then it's going to create a generic copy named blog copy, which I am now going to rename to call Chapter 6 complete up through page 89. Well, that's pretty descriptive, right? So that way when I look at this next week or in the future, or when, I completely blow things apart maybe later in the class tonight, I can go back to this spot and not have to recreate all the work that we've done so far in the semester to get back to the same point. That's a really critical thing if you stop and think about that, because can you imagine what would happen to you if you're working professionally and you did that? Especially if you have, many man hours put into the project and you accomplish some things that, maybe sometimes you don't even remember how you got there. Yeah, it can be pretty devastating on a real project. So the other thing now that you might want to keep in mind for yourselves. Now, I'm not actively using GitHub in the class. Um, and as we proceed forward, I really don't have much intent to do that. But I do want to tell you that one of the reasons I have you set up a GitHub account is you can actually version your work directly to GitHub. So in other words, you can store the files out in the cloud in GitHub, and then every time you sit down and work and create a new version, GitHub will automatically keep track of it for you if you use the environment correctly. There's great videos out there online on YouTube. There's great tutorials on GitHub itself that walk you through that whole process. And it's beautiful because the secondary advantage of that, of course, is that this work also then exists in the cloud. So you have that scenario where, let's say, lightning strikes, or I drive off a bridge and land in a lake and my laptop is with me, that I don't lose the work because it's only on my hard drive. And actually, right now, that is the case for me. It is only on this hard drive. So if I wanted to be double extra safe, I might actually zip this and email it to myself, or put it in my Dropbox or Google Drive or OneDrive or whatever tool you use. So just food for thought, and really knowing some of the challenges that are coming up in the tail end of this chapter, and as we go into chapter 7 and 8, this becomes a real critical issue. The other thing I want to point out in regards to this is if you go to the course shell, you guys will notice that I did release Unit 5, which is going to cover chapters 7 and 8. And the thing about chapters 7 and 8 is, as you can imagine, things aren't necessarily going to get easier from here as we move forward. We're going to be actually switching away from all this database stuff, and then we're going to be jumping back into working from the command line a lot, and also coding files and working with lots of different tools. You can see the whole list of things that we're working with. So at that point, if you are running into problems and finding that your code's not working correctly, and unfortunately, if you want to do chapter 7 and 8, chapter 7 assumes that 6 is done, and chapter 8 assumes that 7 is done. So what I've done there is I've actually put in complete zipped working versions. Now, caveat. Here's the caveat. These were shared last year. So the version differences might be different. And what you should know with these weird open source technologies is when you have version differences, sometimes things get deprecated or code changes. So just because they're listed as complete doesn't mean that necessarily they'll work within our environment. They should, and I say that pensively, they should, for most intents and purposes, work. Worst case scenario is you could match version numbers of the software we were using last year, and then it should work. The other thing to keep in mind is once we complete chapter 6 and chapter 7, I'll probably repost the completed versions here. And then as we move forward through each chapter from there on in, I will probably always share with you a completed version after the due date, of course, because otherwise we can't really move forward. And then how will you finish your work if you don't have something working to work from? Okay, so that's enough of my standing on the podium here and kind of giving you the riot act on making versions of your work when I've been really bad about doing it myself. But we're going to continue on our path here. I do want you to also notice that I do have videos posted for all the chapter 5 and 6 work that we've done so far. And the recording software that I'm using no longer automatically renders to Gateway's video server, which is a little disconcerting, but that requires me to manually upload everything to YouTube, which is a little different than I've done, and thus the delay on putting them out there. My hope is that this will be out there by midday tomorrow. That's my plan. So just please keep that in mind. All right. Jumping back over to the book and just kind of doing a real quick little refresher here as to where we were at. All right. So because we were working with relationships, and if you remember the different types of relationships that you have within databases, and you can think through them in your head. There's the one-to-one, the one-to-many, and the many-to-many. Those are the basic types of relationships. But sometimes when you combine, excuse me, a relationship and combine that with enforcing either a primary key or foreign key relationship, then you're kind of enforcing what they call referential integrity. And the one tool that we've used so far, which is the has one, has a few options that you can append to it in the form of symbol names that perform specific tasks. All right, let's just take a really quick look at the stuff in this table and notice, for example, we were working with users and then we kind of figured out how this syntax really makes sense relative to how things work. So for example, anytime that we have an entry in the user table, each one of those users has one profile, right? And that's the whole reason we use the has one as the reference type. And that's a pretty logical thing. So the relationship between the user table and the profile table, yes, page 90, that's correct, is a one-to-one relationship. And that's why we say has one profile. And this is all from the standpoint of the user table. But then notice appended to that, and like I said, in the form of a symbol name, we say class name account. And what this really means is it specifies the format of how these things are linked together is really kind of the way I think about it. The book says specifies the class name of the association used when the class name can't be inferred from the association name. So what do you think about when you think user? You know, you can think of it many different ways, but really what it's referring to is the user account. So you see how this is basically a symbolic name for that connection. So user account has one profile. And if you think of like just talking through it like that, it makes a lot of sense. So that's why it's important when you name your tables and all the different objects that you choose names that make sense as to what those objects are in the program. Very simple. Sometimes you will actually declare specific conditions. And the reason that you do something like this is if you actually need that to be dropped in as a component of a SQL statement, which is kind of interesting. So, you know, we might have a field that indicates if something is active or not. And you can assume that if active is set to 1, it's probably a true. But I'm not really sure, you know, in this regard. The other thing that we can also point out is the foreign key. So which field is the foreign key in the table that links us back, so we can actually declare that. Or is there an order to be declared in a SQL statement? And you can see the SQL terminology that's put in there. The other thing that's kind of interesting here, and this is a pretty powerful one, is this dependent option. And what this one basically does, I don't mean to highlight that all, is you want to think about this real carefully. If you have a user on your system and you have a one-to-one relationship that is basically symbiotic, you know, so you can't have the user without the user having a profile and vice versa, then we want to make the destruction of either record in either table dependent on the destruction of the other. So in other words, if I delete your user account, we also want the profile to be deleted at the same time, or vice versa. It makes no sense to delete a profile for a user that exists or to delete a user for a profile that exists without deleting them together. So you see how that one is a pretty important feature. So that's something that, really you have to think about when you're designing the application, and it really requires you to put on the hat of a database developer, at least temporarily. You guys have had enough training at this point from at least the database class where you should be thinking in that capacity, and maybe you're not. But this is, a refresher. So put that in your head that sometimes you have tables that have that relationship between each other where it requires that if you have one record in one, it must have a record in the other and vice versa. Okay, so that's an important one. And I don't mean to carry on with it, but I think that's significant, at least in this situation. All right, we're going to move on to the next type of association, and this is a one-to-one, or excuse me, a one-to-many association. So that means, for example, and this is the setup here, and I like that they have the terminology and the link demonstrated here, is you might have a user in your system who also has created not one article, but many articles. So that's a really good example. So notice the terminology, user has many articles. So the relationship between user and articles is one user, many articles. That's the way that association is intended to go. The other thing that happens conversely is you cannot have an article without it belonging to a user. So you can't just create an article and not have an author for it. You have to attribute it to a user account. Thus the terminology belongs to. In the previous example, in the previous section of the book, what we had was a has one and belongs to was still there. Now, this is kind of interesting, though. If you think back to that dependent thing that we were just looking at above, would you say that if I deleted a user from the system that all their articles should go away? That takes a little bit more thought than the user and the profile, doesn't it? In fact, you could make arguments going both ways. So that really would become a very subjective design decision that maybe the person who created an article has dropped off the system, but you know what? Their article still exists. So something to think about. Now, in order to do the next step here, of course, we are going to need to bring a prompt up. And I stopped at the point where I stopped last time because we are working with temporary variables in memory, and this is actually going to be kind of a clean starting point for us, relatively speaking. So let's go ahead and bring up a prompt, get it up on screen, and see if we can be strategic with our use of screen space here. I'm going to collapse my sidebar. And that looks pretty good to me. Not perfect, but pretty good. All right, we want to navigate to the folder where our work is. So I'm going to go to CD / to go to the roots. And then I'm going to type CD project / blog to go into the active project. At this point, I'm going to issue the Rails command that we see written in the book here. So I'm going to type it in and then tell you what it's going to do. So the command is Rails generate migration add _ user ID to articles. Now what I just typed there alone says a lot, doesn't it? I mean, notice the super descriptive name that's being used. You can already anticipate what we're going to do here. We're going to set it up so that if we want to create this association that we see in the book, right now we have to add a user ID column to the articles table, otherwise we cannot forge that relationship. So doesn't it make sense that if we're going to generate a migration for the database, that we call it exactly what it is intended to do? So you see that logic. All right. The next part is we're actually declaring the field name that we're going to use, which is going to be user ID. It's going to be all lowercase with underscore in between. And the data type will be integer to match up with the ID column in the users table. All right, once you've got that typed in, go ahead and press enter. Take a little bit of time to generate that. All right, didn't really create a lot, right? And the reason is here, instead of like generating, a scaffolding, okay, and I want you to think about that real carefully. We're just generating the migration. We're not creating a table at this point. We're just adding a column to it. Now, granted, aside from the fact that we told it what it is we're adding, which is a user ID column that's an integer, there's not really a whole lot more to it. So let's go ahead and look at the file that they're pointing us to at this point. So we're going to go and look at this particular folder. So we're going to go to db migrate and then find the migration that we just created. So I'm going to pull up my file folder here. We're going to go into the database folder, migrate, and then add user ID to articles. And if it helps you at all here, I mean, that was pretty easy to find, but when you start to get a list of these, sometimes it's a lot easier to reverse sort by date, so it just pops right up to the top. Go ahead and open that up with whatever text editor you're using, and let's take a look at what we have versus what we're seeing in the book. All right, so notice the 5.2, now we've been seeing this all along with Active Record. The 5.2 doesn't exist here, but we leave that alone because it does indicate version numbers, so it must be some impact. And then notice the command inside here. It says add column articles. Okay, so where are we adding it to? To the articles table. It's user ID integer. And I see that it matches up exactly what's in the book. And the only reason I'm doing this is not that I don't trust that it happened. I know well enough from doing it many times that, yes, I do trust it happened. But you know what? It doesn't hurt to double check. Not that you can't undo the changes later, but it's better to make sure ahead of time rather than to redo things. Next thing that we want to do is run the migrate command. So this is a rake command. So I'm going to type rake db : migrate and press enter. And then, of course, what this does is it actually looks for whatever migrations have not happened in that folder. It found the one that we created today, and it is running that change in the database table. Now, assuming the change happened, well, how do we know? Well, let's bring up that SQLite browser. We need to connect to it, of course, if you guys remember this process. So we find the project, find the blog, find the database. We are working with the development database right now. We're not in deployment mode. And then we're going to look at the articles table. And if we take a look at the articles table now, you will see that we do have a user ID column put in. So that confirms that it was successful and it actually did what we asked it to do. I'm going to actually close this tool for right now. All right, so we have that now migrated in, and now we're going to move on to the next set of commands here. Now the next task really is to set up a little bit of validation to kind of enforce a couple of things. And actually, it's not the validation piece, but to enforce the relationship. And I'm sorry for using the wrong words there. So you see how there's a little insert here of belongs to that forces that foreign key relationship to take place. So where do we go for that? We go to app models article RB. So we're going to go to blog app models article RB. Let's open that up in our editor. And then you can see as we compare with the book that we already have the validations for title and body. It's in a different format here, but it still works the same. We also have the long title piece that we kind of custom coded in there. And now we're going to add this belongs underscore to user. So conceptually, from the standpoint of the article, we are putting in a foreign key relationship now back to the user table, indicating that this article, or any article in particular, can belong to a particular user. Pretty simple. Make sure you do a Control S to save. The other thing we have to do is we also have to change the user Ruby file as well. So let's go ahead and open that one up. So I'm just going to drag and drop it into my editor here. And for this one, we already have the declaration for has one profile, right? So that's a pretty logical one, that every profile matches up with one particular user. And now we're indicating a one-to-many relationship. So instead of has one, which is one-to-one, this has many articles. And I want you to also notice, the plurality here, that we are saying articles plural, which is fascinating. It's a fascinating thing about this language. And it was a very conscious choice by the creator. And I guess the people revising it, for that matter. All right, so make sure you also save those changes, because just very simply typing it in doesn't make it stick. Now, they're going to have us run this reload command again. And you know what? I'm going to go through the mechanics of it, even though technically it's not really necessary, because I've shut down and rebooted my machine since last week. So all the stuff that was stuck in memory was cleared and refreshed and everything. But I would suggest that you do that. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and type reload exclamation. And why didn't that work? I'm just, you see, I'm catching it now, right? What's the difference? What kind of prompt is this? The $sign is the indicator of a bash prompt. And if you're on Windows, it's the C prompt or whatever drive you're working on. But when we see this style of prompt, it indicates what? A Rails console prompt or an interactive Ruby prompt. So in order for this to work then, I do need to type Rails console. And this also indicates to you that this is one of these scenarios where you might want to have a C prompt open and then have a separate window open for your Rails console. That's not unusual when you do this type of work. All right, so let's go ahead and type reload, even though it's basically irrelevant, but let's do it anyhow. And thank you very much, it did it. And now we're going to declare a variable on the fly. So we're going to call it user equals user.first, pulls the first user from the table, and loads it in. Right. And we came up with a really creative name, user@example.com, with a password of secret. Remember that? Very, very secure. At this point, we're going to type in this next command, which is user articles, which of course will return all the articles this user has created, which of course, because we've forged no associations, we put no values in the table, we know it's going to come back with an empty result set. But I do want you to notice how in the old version, they would just give you empty square brackets as a result, And in the newer version, they give you significantly more detail. But still, end of the whole process, you still end up with those empty square brackets, indicating there's nothing there. So of course, absolutely, there is no connection. Now this next command that we're going to type, this is where it gets kind of interesting, and I love some of these commands in this language, which this is what makes it fun for me, at least, you know. Shows what I do for fun on the weekends, I suppose. Is I'm going to type user.articles, right, which from the conceptual standpoint here, I want you to think about what I just typed there. I'm saying the user that I just created as a variable, which inside of it is what? What is that? What is user holding right now? Yeah, it's holding the first user of the table. So the first user of the table dot articles, right? And that's an association that is empty right now. We just proved it by typing it. But now we're using that double bracket pointing its direction to say, well, you know what we should put in there? You know what link we should make? The link we should make is that article dot first, the first article of the table is now going to be linked to the first user using that articles column. So I'm going to press enter here. And then it's forging that association. If you want to double check it, you could open up your SQLite browser and take a look, and you will see that the user ID of 1 is now attributed to that table. In fact, why don't we just go ahead and do that really quick? And even though it's kind of cumbersome to always reload it, I feel safer doing it that way. Although I haven't really had too many problems with it in the past, frankly. And then we're going to look at the tables. So if I look at the article table, you notice the first article now has that link to the first user. You want to look at your users. We only have one. But we now do have that association between articles and user. And it's in the database. I think that's fantastic. Beautifully simple. All right, so if we type the next command, which is user.articles.size, of course it's going to come back with 1, because that's all the articles he has at this point. And if you just type user.articles now, like we did before, it's going to pull back however many articles there are, in this case just 1, and pull it back up onto the screen for us. So here's the typing of the command right here. And here's the output, user ID 1. And you can see it pulls in that first 1. And it also indicates that last column, user ID 1. So it shows that connection between the tables being forged. Now the interesting thing that's kind of weird about this language here is kind of like the flexibility in which you can issue the commands. So now we're going to type article. So this is pulling directly from the table. And we're going to say dot first. So whatever the first article is, tell me the user ID. And you see how you kind of chain them together, and it just pulls back the data. So article, right from the table, first, whichever the first one is, what's in the user ID column? The number 1. If you wanted to experiment with that a little bit, you could always type last, and notice how that's nil, right? Because that one doesn't have an entry, right? And no harm done. We didn't break anything by typing in that command. The next one that they want us to type in is article.first user. Notice different, not user ID, user. So what does this pull back? It actually pulls back the whole user login information. So it gives you the username or login and their password. Isn't that interesting, right? So what that proves to us is those two tables are now connected. And because that connection's in place, we can utilize this beautiful little syntax to kind of like traverse the structure pretty seamlessly. Now on this next table here, the top of page 93, they go through and they show you a number of different methods and approaches that you can use and what they're used for. And there's many of them. And if you want to experiment, please feel free to do it to your heart's content. Reading it, is fine as well, but you can read about what some of these methods do. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is not all of the methods that are available. These are just some of the common ones that people use. And you mean parentheses? Yes. That's a great question. In fact, okay, so the question that's being asked in the room is, why are we using parentheses here, and what exactly does that denote? Well, the way I like to think about it, because normally when we're working with a method in most languages, we usually see the parentheses, and it typically implies parameter passing, correct? I mean, that's what we've been trained to think. And you know what? For the most part, that's still the case here. So if you look at like the syntax, and it's more apparent here, for example. So the method is delete, and what's inside there are the articles. So for example, in this case, if you have a user associated to this variable, and we're saying the user articles, and let's say he's got 5 articles, okay? And then I issue the delete method, but of course, what are we passing? What are we asking to delete? In this case, we're asking to delete the articles themselves, and if that user had 5 articles, it would delete all 5. So in this case, it really is a parameter. The parentheses? You do use the parentheses, yes. Did you try it and have a different result? Yeah, okay, Robert, you're catching one of the quirks of the languages. That is the case with some commands. So what Robert's asking is, in some cases, it seems like you don't need the parentheses, and that can be the case. In some cases, you would either, for example, denote the ID number of the article, for example, but then you would have to say that as a parameter. Or you might indicate the title, but you would also say that as a parameter. And in that case, you would actually denote it in the form of colon, title, equals, bracket, in quotes, the title. That would be okay too. Provided that what you're passing to it fits the format that's accepted by the language. And that can be highly variable, as I think you're kind of detecting. So frankly, sometimes it is a little bit trial and error. But if you stop and really think through what you're doing carefully and what variables you got in memory, you should be okay. Typically, I wouldn't go ahead and run a command that would delete everybody's articles. I mean, just for example, I think that would be kind of a hasty move. But it is possible, right? Okay. So the next question that Robert has, and these are great questions, is why do we have this format where we have what seems to be a parameter and then certain attributes? So in this case, okay, so if we look at this command, and this is a very different one because this is a create, right? And if you think about what the create method does, this actually creates columns in the table. So in order to run that command, we have to specify the fact that we are creating attributes. And then inside the curly brackets, in comma-separated pairs, we would put in, for example, well, if you look at the example they have on the side here, right? Let's say this. Okay, so look at that little example right there. In that example, we aren't actually using the keyword attributes to perform the work. However, if we are adding one single value or one single column to a table, we could say the title and then the thing that we're adding. Now, the other thing I want to be really cautious about this with is I don't want you to think that we're necessarily brute force changing the table as much as we are brute force adding the value to the column itself. And I don't know if you're catching that distinction or not, but the way that I like to think about it is the example that I have highlighted right now, what they're actually doing is they're creating the content to put in the title column. That's what's happening in that little example. If you are actually creating the columns themselves, and this is something we did earlier on, we actually did these commands. If you refer back to that, they'll show you the exact format that you use if you actually want to create the columns too. So it's kind of a double-edged sword because it does both. It can add the value or it can create the column. You don't see curly brackets in this case. Well, okay, so not necessarily. If you have more than one column that you're adding, yes. So it's like the examples they're providing relative to the example that they're showing is pretty simplistic. But if you have multiple columns that you're adding, you'd use the curly brackets. If you're just adding multiple values, you just comma separate them. It's interesting though, right? And this is one where you got to be really careful. Chances are you probably wouldn't do the work this way anyhow. Just telling you from a practical standpoint. That very often what a lot of people do is they're not really typing the commands necessarily from the prompt like this. I know a lot of people that work in this infrastructure, they use a graphical tool to design the database because they're more comfortable that way. And if you think about that. The people who tend to be okay with the prompt are people that have done old school database work where we did everything from the prompt. And we're not afraid of it. You know what I mean? But if you're not comfortable with it, you got to remember this, that if you do it from the prompt and the result is not what you want, you can always undo it. And if you're not sure how to undo it from the prompt, jump into the graphical tool, delete the column or delete the data or whatever the case may be. Hopefully that helps. Okay, I'm looking at the clock here, you guys. I'm trying to find a good stopping point. So let's finish the bottom of this page and the top of the next, and then we'll take a break here in class. All right, so let's go back to the prompt and issue the next command. So the next command is user.articles, and we had already typed this. And you can see that it's going to bring back, you know, whatever article is associated with it. Okay. Did this change at all? No, it hasn't changed. But let's go to the next command. So the next command is user.articles, double brackets pointing left. And that indicates the way that we're kind of sending the information. And we say article.new. And actually, here is an example of that last one that we were just talking about, using a simple approach. But this is actually not the create command, it's the title. Or it's the new command. And if you look up top here, I don't know if they even have the new one in there, but I guess they don't. So here we're in the symbolic form, title. One, two, many associations. Close the quotes. Then the body Gotta be careful how you type this here. And now they want a bunch of text here. One, two, many associations. Describe a pattern of whatever. Yada, yada, yada. It's just some text for the body. All right, so I'm typing a little bit in there just to get it to stick. Then I'm going to close my parens here and press enter. So now what this did, of course, is it created a new article attributed to the user stored in this variable, right? So that's the first user. And really what we should do now is we should come back here, we should hit the refresh, and notice, indeed, we have a new article with a title of one-to-many associations. Here's all the body text with the yada, yada, yadas in it. And then notice that it's now attributed to user one. That simple command that we just typed. That's kind of neat, really. All right, now if you hit the up arrow here, and you type user articles underscore ID, or IDs plural, excuse me, it will spit back the, oh, so it didn't like that. Oh, I see what I did wrong too. You guys catch it? User.article underscore IDs. And it tells me the ID numbers of the articles associated to this user. In this case, for me, it's 1 and 8. For the book, it was 6 and 7. If I do user.articles.first, see which one it pulls up? The first one, of course. If I type user.articles.clear, what do you suppose clear does? It nullifies all the foreign keys. Now, that's not really a great idea, but if I go back to the table now and hit the refresh, see how they cleared out the IDs? And you know what? That's probably a smarter thing to do. Like if you have a bunch of articles associated with somebody in an application like this, instead of deleting the articles, to nullify the IDs and then delete the user. If you see the logic that I'm kind of pointing to there. Now, of course, if you do the user articles.count, it's going to count 0, right? Because I broke all the associations. If I type article.count, just counts all the articles that we have, there's 7. The book says 2, but I have 7. If I want to kind of go back through this process again and do a user.articles.create, now notice the syntax here. And notice how this is quite different. And notice, and this is why you're asking, Robert, correctly? Correct? Because I don't see any parentheses here. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do it once like the book does it, and then we'll do a separate one with the parentheses. Did you try that? Oh, that's great. I'm glad you did. Trying a bunch of different things is exactly the right way to do it because, you know, what's the worst thing you're going to do? Break it? Well, maybe. Just remember, that's why the backup's important because that way if you do, I'm just going to call this one whatever. I hope you don't mind. And what's the next thing they want us to type? And then the body. And how about just like a whole bunch of yada, yada, yadas? parentheses, correct? And it looked like it worked, so let's go back. So let's refresh the, this is the articles database. So you see, it enforces the relationship. Now let's try it with the parentheses. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reiterate that last command, put in the parentheses, did it work? It did. Now, for some people, I'm going to tell you what, it makes people very uncomfortable that there's more than one way to do it. Because it doesn't seem like that should be correct. Yeah, and that's a conscious choice, and that happens in a lot of languages like this. So it happens with Python, JavaScript, Ruby. These are all languages that are interpreted languages, so they operate on the fly. And they tend to be a lot more flexible and a lot more forgiving. Yeah, sometimes forgiving to the point of being almost criminal. Because when you sit there and you learn a language like Java, and your one character's off and the whole thing breaks, it's a little uncomfortable. All right, let's see if there's anything else we need to finish up here before we go to break. All right, so this class, or this, has many tool also has a number of different options that go with it, which are very, very similar to the ones that we saw before. In fact, for the most part, they're identical. So I don't feel compelled to really talk about them too much, but I will tell you that this is the great spot to stop before we go into this next section. So we're going to take a 5-minute break here in class. We'll come back and resume in a few minutes. All right, we're back from our break, and we're going to continue on. And we're at the bottom of page 94, going on to 95. And what we want to do now, the next little step, is to actually take some of the things that we saw and actually add it into some of our code. And this will actually be an example, because we had the question before of like, when do you use the curly brackets, for example. Now, we're going to be actually specifying some sort orders here right inside our data model. So what we're going to do here is we're going to open up this file. And now this one, it's interesting, and sometimes they tell you which file you're opening and sometimes not. But this is the user RB file in the app models folder, if you're curious. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that one up as soon as I find my folder here, which is probably already open in Notepad++, right here. And we're going to just make that little bit of a tweak to it. So right after articles here, I'm going to go ahead and insert a comma. Then notice here the difference in the syntax. Notice this isn't an equal sign, it's a dash as a pointer. And now we're going to use our curly brackets, and we're going to say order. And this is actually a SQL directive that we're putting in. So we're actually, reality is we're inserting SQL code here. And of course, what this indicates is that we're going to sort in descending order by published at date. So what that means, of course, is the newest should be on top as opposed to the bottom. Go ahead and save this particular file. And if you're a SQL person, you recognize this terminology immediately, because that's exactly the same format they use in SQL. And Robert is pointing out here in class that this format is different from what they were showing on the previous page. And That has to do partially with the fact that in this format, we're adding it into a code file, whereas from the prompt, we're typing it in as a command. That's really part of the difference. But that's a good thing to point out. Thank you. And the next one they're going to add here is the fact that we can actually do a secondary sort order, which really won't give us much here because we hardly have any articles. But we could sort descending by published at date, and then within that format, sort ascending by title. So like if you had, 5 articles on the same day, those would appear at the top, but then we would sort those 5 alphabetically. That's kind of the logic here. So if you want to go ahead and add that in, please feel free. Once again, make sure you save the work. If you want to also throw in a dependency. Now this is, once again, one of those things where we want to be able to, let's say, delete a user and then also delete their content at the same time. Now, my opinion on that isn't one where you should act hastily. So I wouldn't go throwing this into every application that you do because I don't think this is necessarily the best choice. But the command that they're throwing in, if you look at it, is it's just dependent and then destroy. And that's pretty powerful, really, because we're saying that if we're deleting an article, we're deleting the user. Yeah. And isn't this fascinating too? Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, we do need the colon there. You got to be really careful with this one. And I'm not a huge fan of this. For me, it would make more sense to put that in with the profile than it would be with the article. But that's just my thinking. So just take that for whatever it's worth. All right, make sure you save that. And then there's this other option here that now they're finally pointing out that, maybe this isn't really the smartest way to do it. That if you're going to delete the user, maybe instead of destroying the articles, which probably still have good information, maybe it's better to actually nullify the user link. So in other words, we delete the user and we nullify the user ID column instead of destroying the article too. It doesn't make any sense. So this is a much better thing. And this one I would be in favor of. Just logically makes more sense. Next type of association we need to talk about is the many-to-many association. This one, of course, means that we have links that will go to many locations. So for example, in this case, look at the little diagram that they've created for us. And look at the terminology that they're using. So this is has and belongs to many. And really what we're using here as kind of the connecting piece, and this is kind of interesting. Now, we're looking at tables that we haven't created yet, for one thing. But it's a logical progression. If we have a table full of articles, sometimes you'll notice if you go to like a newspaper site or a blog site, real common, to take the articles that are published on the site and put them into specific categories. So if we use an example of, let's say, a news site, you would have a category for sports and weather and business and international or whatever, just categories. Think of whatever those categories are. In technology, we'd probably have different ones. But in order to be able to create this has and belongs to many type of relationship, this many-to-many relationship, it really kind of requires an intermediary piece, and that would be another table that kind of holds the link between them. Now this seems a little counterintuitive initially until you start to logic through exactly what that means. So now think about an article as being placed into a category. But if I write an article about the Green Bay Packers, for example, so it fits into sports, could I not also include in that article information about the weather, which might impact the game? Absolutely you could. So it could belong to many categories at the same time. So this is kind of an interesting little piece. Now, in order to be able to do this next section, of course, we need to create some additional components for the database. It looks like we're going to be creating at least 2 tables, but I want you to see how we're going to do that. So let's go back to our prompt. I'm going to try to pull that over just a little further. And notice the prompt that we're using here. That is the bash prompt or the C prompt. Now, instead of messing with this open window that I already have going, you know what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to open up another command prompt window. And you might say to yourself, can I do that? Well, sure, why not? No harm done. So I'm going to go ahead and expand this out. I'm going to navigate to the correct folder. So I'm just going to type cd, c:/projects/blog. You can do that. Absolutely you can. You can navigate directly to it if you know what the name of it is. And I happen to know that. And now I'm going to issue the command. So I'm going to type Rails generate. Notice we're not doing a migration this time. We're doing a model. We are creating a new table, in essence, a new data model as a result. And this is going to be called category. And then I want you to think, before I do this, what is the plural of category? So that's something to put in the back of your head, because whenever we're going to deal with anything related to the category, the plural is categories. So notice up above in the diagrams how categories is what's used. And they want us to go ahead and add a field to that model called name, which will be a string. You go ahead and press enter, let it do its work. All right, you can see it created a migration for us. So if it's creating a migration, the thought you should have in your head is this. It created a code file for me in the app models folder, but this is not part of my database until I run the rake db migrate command. Make sense? Because that's important. All right, next thing that we need to do is another generate command. So generate migration, create articles categories plural. So really what that's going to do, oh yes, thank you, excellent catch, is it's going to create this intermediary component that's going to tie everything together. Let's go ahead and press enter on that. As we wait to do that, let's scroll. So it just created the migration, the difference between the two commands. Next thing that we want to do before we run the migration is we want to tweak a little bit of code, or at the very least look. But let's go look at the migration file that we just created, create articles category. So we're going to bring up our file folders here. Go to the database folder, migrate. Let's see the reverse sort here up on top. Let's pull this into our text editor. And then let's tweak this to match what we see in the book. All right, so in the change method here, we do have the create table, articles, categories, right? So we have that in place, but here's what it's not doing for us, is it's not actually putting in any of the stuff that goes into that table. Now there's 2 reasons for that. First of all, at the prompt, We didn't tell it to. We could have actually at the prompt typed in the command, but what this is showing you is you can come in here and manually type in the stuff that you need. So in this case, because this is basically a reference to another table, what are we referencing? We're referencing article. And then we're going to create another reference for category. So really, in essence, what we're doing here is these two lines of code are tying those tables together. And you're catching another mistake I made? Oh, yeah, it did an auto type. Gets you every time. Careful with that auto type. The next thing that we want to do is we're going to add a little piece here. This is kind of an interesting one. So we're going to define a new method. And this one's going to be called self.down. And I want you to think about what this does. And notice I'm going to type the end command first. That's kind of this little habit I have when, I kind of, when I open a curly bracket, I close it. Well, in this language, a lot of times I'll define something and close it right away too, if you ever see me doing that. But we're going to do this thing called a drop table. Anybody have a guess as to what that could be? All right, and we're going to append to that articles. And here's where it should have auto-typed, and now it's not doing it. Of course. Articles.categories. So really, we're putting a piece in place here that's actually going to create a little structure when you're and I'm being pointed out all my mistakes left and right. So thank you very much, Robert. I will call you out by name because actually you're just paying more attention than I am, I think. We're missing a piece here. And this is actually what we're typing in right now is kind of an interesting little structure if you think about what's happening. And I'm going to just expand it just ever so slightly and take a look at the syntax on this. This syntax is kind of interesting. Yeah, and Robert keeps pointing out my mistakes. You might have to actually reduce your grade instead of improve it. Sometimes it's more fun to watch a teacher mess it up and point out the mistakes on the fly. But yes, and actually, what's going on here is this is the part where we're looping, where it initiates the loop. But really, what we're doing is we're going through two different symbolic things here. So, is we're actually running two different symbols through there at the same time as we go through the table, which you can absolutely do. Let's go ahead and save this migration. And then we better double check our syntax, I suppose, given all the mistakes I've been making so far. So we got the migration, we got the article categories, the ID, that's going to be set to false. We're going to loop through. We're going to create references to the article and the category. And then we're creating a little drop-down tool that will pull up the categories for us. All right, and if those are typed in correctly, we can go ahead and run our migration now. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and run rake db migrate. Let's see what happens. All right, looks like it succeeded. So it did create the migration. And you can see that it's not just one migration, but two migrations, because we had both the first command that we did before where it created the categories, and now we're creating that intermediary table which links them together, and both of those are added. If I go back to my database tool and I do a refresh and I take a look, I will now see that I have an articles categories table and a categories table both. See, those were not there before, and are there as the result of running that command. Right, so I have a little bit more work to do here to enforce some of the foreign key relationships. So let's go ahead and get into this file, app models article, and I think that one's still open in my tool here. And it sure is. And we want to make a couple of tweaks here to this. So we already have belongs to user, and now we want to add has and belongs to many. And then we got categories. And if you think about this, just logically, right? This is from the perspective of the article. The article has and belongs to many categories. So an article could be in two different categories at the same time. And once that association is made, or that link, then it works in the converse as well. So it can belong to several categories, and it could be in several categories. So you see how the syntax works there, or the logic. We also have to put in that association with the category table. So now we have to find that category file in the same folder. So I'm going to navigate to App, Models, and Category. Let's pull that in. And then the code we need to add here is just simply has and belongs to many articles. That looks easy enough to copy paste, so let's do that. So that makes sense as well, right? So a category could have many articles within it, and so that many-to-many relationship, because it's a many-to-many relationship, it uses the same syntax from both locations. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So those are pretty significant little changes there, but isn't it interesting? We can't like add this code in to enforce the relationship until after the connection or after the database components have been created. But the thing that's fascinating about this technology is if you think about how you might do the same thing with a different tool. So think of how you might do this type of work in SQL Server, for example, or in MySQL, or Microsoft Access for that matter. Some of them have graphical tools, some of them have coding approaches to use. In this construct, we use the tools to build the actual database, and those tools or those tables exist as their own entity. The relationships within that database really are defined here within the code of the application. And that's really kind of a fascinating difference between this and some other languages. All right, let's talk now about another important concept. This is called seeding data. So here we are using code to create database constructs. And then we use code to form relationships between the tables and the pieces of the database. But now we want to actually add data to the database without like doing it from the command line one by one, and without going into the graphical tool and typing it in. And actually you could do it that way, and that's fine. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to actually use a file. So we're going to go to the db seeds rb file. Let's go find that. So blog db seeds. We have a seed file here. We'll open that up in Notepad++, and you notice there really is no code in here right now, and they give you examples and comments. Now you can blow the comments away if you want. Frankly, I'm just going to leave them. No big deal. So if you want, you could try to just copy and paste all of this in, which is what I'm going to try to do, and hopefully it comes in clean, and in this case, maybe not so much, but at least we tried. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up my code so it looks like what we see in the book. So I'm going to focus on the first line first. That looks fine. But then you notice when we get to the second section how they're formatting their text. And really, you know what, folks? It doesn't matter what the format is or the indents or the tabs. I could just leave this alone. Really, what the reason that they're, for example, moving all this stuff over is just so it lines up and it's easy to read. And you can see that the first thing that we added, so up on line 8, you're seeing that we're actually, just like we do at the prompt, right? We're setting up a variable name for user. And then we're running user.create. We're pushing in their email address, because that's required in that table, and a password, yes, in plain text. And could I put parentheses around this, Robert? Probably. And it'll work just fine. We've already actually proven that. And really the code that you see here would work at the prompt. All right, but in this case, they're not. Okay, they're not doing that. So in the next line, we're saying category, and knowing that it's a capital C category, it's working directly with the table, we're going to do a create. And then notice what we're doing here in the form of an array. We're passing in attributes for each particular thing. So what we're doing really is we're saying we're creating categories for our articles. So one's going to be for programming, one's for event, one's for travel, one's for music, and one is for TV. Comma separated, but they're all going into that same column. Now if I go to my database and take a quick look, and I look at the categories table, I see that I do have a field called name. Created at and updated at, those are automatically generated and are typically part of every thing unless we remove the timestamps declaration. And the ID field is automatically generated. So really the only spot where you can really insert data is here. If there were other columns, we could insert those, for example, inside of here. So if we had like, think of a, whatever column name you want and give it more data right inside there in that format. Not necessary in this case because there's only one field to fill, but if there were 5 fields to fill, I would put them all in here in comma separated key value pairs. All right, so we have our categories created, and this is going into a seed file. Now what happens with a seed file is, once again, I've created code. It's done nothing. But I am now going to run a command that's going to take these seeds and plant them, if you will, into the application. So I'm going to insert this data into the application. And when you look at this, you might say, well, I could just go into the database tool and just type the stuff in, right? Sure, why not? I could go in and I could add the user directly into the database, right? Sure, why not? You could do that. But if you're thinking about building an application, and right now I've added 5 categories, but what if I wasn't coming up with categories? What if I was like doing a list of the United States, for example, or all the countries on planet Earth? I mean, you can think of a lot of different scenarios where you might have a file that's being dumped from a different database or a flat file, or better yet, you have an intern that's typing this up for you that puts it all into a seed file, and then the data can be looked at, parsed, reviewed, analyzed before it goes in. But once we determine it's ready to insert, all we have to do is run one command and it puts it all in at once. And so for however cumbersome you think this might be, this is actually in many ways a more efficient way to insert information into a database than some other methods that you might be familiar with. Now to add that to the database, we have to run this command. So it's kind of like the migrate command, except this is a seed command. So at the prompt, yes, at the C prompt, we're going to type rake db : seed. It will take the stuff that's in that seeds file and plant it into the database as we've specified. Give that a second to do the work. That was pretty quick. Now if we had a file that, let's say we were inserting like 1,000 lines of code, like 1,000 entries to the database, that would obviously take just a little bit more time. Let's verify that it actually worked though, because I'm not always comfortable with just believing it. right? So come back here and I hit refresh, and now you can see the names of the categories have been added. I can also go to the user table and notice that Mary at example.com and her guess it password were also added to the database. So it looks like the seeds work just fine. All right, so the next thing that we have to do is, if you notice, we're switching now from the standard prompt, the bash prompt or the C prompt, back over to the console prompt. So if you remember, I actually had two command prompt windows open, so I'm going to switch back to the interactive Ruby prompt at this point, and I am going to issue a reload command. And see, this is one of my little gripes with the book. You know, I noticed it when I was reading, and I highlighted it. And I highlighted it so that when I'm teaching it in class, I remember to type it in, right? But in all the previous examples, you remember that they always had it like listed with the prompt, so you knew to type it in. So now all of a sudden they're, just being nitpicky. So there's the reload command. So now it's reloaded. So we're kind of flushing memory and all that kind of stuff. And now we're going to type the first command, which is article equals article with a capital A dot last. So we're finding the last article in the database. And of course, it's got that great title, Just a Test. Oh boy, this is cool. All right, got to be fun. And then we're also going to type in category as a variable name again. Then the capital C category. And then we're running a little query here, find by name. And oh boy. We're looking for a particular article. So here's my concern. I'm typing in a name that I might not have. So I'm actually going to go look. So as lame as that sounds, do I have anything with the name programming in it? Now I should probably also double check, is it intending to find nothing? No, actually it is intending to find something. So since I don't have anything with the title of programming in it, why don't I search for something that says, let's pick a word here, that only appears once. SQL, let's search for SQL. Yeah. Oh, no, yeah, Robert, you're right. Oh, boy. So I'm looking at titles, thinking it's in the title. You're absolutely right. You caught me on another mistake. You got 3 points for the day. So we're actually looking, boy, you got to like read what you're typing sometimes, right? So we are looking for the category called programming, which is actually a category. Yes, it's been a long day. So let's go ahead and press enter. And then notice it did find the category. So now we've taken article.last and put it in article. We've taken category find by name programming, so category programming, and put it into category. You can probably guess what we're going to do next. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that article variable and do dot categories plural, and we're going to assign the category that we just set so that that article's categories column, and I feel compelled to show you it in the database so that you're clear on what we're doing. It's all linked up. So here are the articles. We need to refresh this. And here are the categories. And then let's take a look at that third table, category ID. So these are all going to, this is where the magic's going to happen. That's why I'm showing it to you before I run the command, because this is where it gets kind of interesting. All right, so we're going to take that category that we just set, and we're going to apply it to article.categories. All right, so go ahead at the prompt and now press enter. All right. So now, notice if you even read like what the output is, Associations are being forged here, folks. Let's go take a look at the database really quick. Do a refresh. So now you see all of a sudden a new entry, right? Article 10, the last one in my database, is now associated with category ID 1. If I look at the categories, ID 1 is programming. If I look at the articles, Article 10 is this one here. Notice I don't have to have a column here to make the connection. That intermediary table is doing the work for me because that's the table that's doing the many-to-many. It kind of acts as kind of like a transaction point of sorts. All right, let's move on to the next command. And let's find a... And then after we run this next batch of commands here, we're going to have to call it a day because that's a logical stopping point again. So yes, we're going to go into another week on chapter 6. But that's how this chapter is, folks. It's a long chapter. There's a lot of meat to it. So let's finish this up. The next command that we're going to type is article, spelled correctly, dot categories, any. Of course, yes, true, there are, because we just saw it in the database with our own eyes. And that's why I like to have that tool sitting there, because just looking at a prompt and conceptualizing it is difficult. But if you can see it happening in the database, for whatever reason, we feel more comfortable. That's why. Next one is size. How many? Well, we know the answer to that. It's just 1. So you see the 1 as the output down here. Next command. Category, singular, lowercase, spelled correctly. And then the articles. Are they empty? What's the answer to that one? What's the category? Programming. Does it have articles associated with it? Yes, right? Absolutely. We just did that. So empty, the answer is false. That means there are articles in there. Once again, same first two like verbs, if you want to think of them that way. What is the size? We know it's only 1. We want to figure out something more useful, like the first one and its title. It pulls back the title for us. Now, I like this. We're going to end here on this tonight, because if you look at what we did, we built variables. We applied values to them. We forged an association within our tables. We link things together. And then as you start to do that, depending on the order on which you issue the keywords that you're associating. So you got to remember, category is basically category 1 programming from the categories table. And articles are all the things that are associated with that category. And then, of course, we've seen in the past that, yes, we can select the first one from whatever result set we pull back, and we can dig in and pull back any piece of information from it dynamically. That simple little category.articles.first.title is really the culmination of a very much more complicated SQL statement below. And if it hasn't been clear all along what the database abstraction tool does for us, take this little piece here, that little command, and equate it to this SQL statement, and hopefully it will give you that clarity. All right, folks, that's where we end today. So we're finishing up at the top of page 99. And next week we're going to pick up and complete chapter 6. And make sure you guys get here early so we can get this chapter done and behind us. And if necessary, I'm probably going to adjust the due date on this a little bit to accommodate for that, so that everybody has a little bit more breathing space.